They abandoned a tiny baby in a sack to die. But when a lonely cowboy found her, he heard a faint, heartbreaking voice whisper, "Mama." This is the story of a man whose cold heart was melted by a child, and the love he never thought he'd find. Caleb Ryder rode the canyons like a man escaping his own shadow. 38 years old, his face weathered by sun and silent sorrows. He was a cowboy whose world had shrunk to the rhythm of his horse's hooves and the vast, indifferent silence of the Arizona desert. 10 years ago, a wagon accident had claimed his young son, leaving a permanent, jagged scar on his soul. He had built walls around his heart so thick, he sometimes wondered if he even had one left. He believed his capacity for love, for joy, for connection, had died with his boy. Now, he simply existed, driving cattle, mending fences, and seeking only the quiet solitude that numbed the ache of memory. It was on one such routine patrol, far from any established trail, that his hardened routine was shattered. The sun was setting, painting the canyon walls in hues of fire and deep purple, when he saw it. A rough burlap sack, discarded by the side of the trail, half buried in the dust. His first thought was irritation. Some thoughtless traveler had left their trash. He dismounted, intending to kick the sack aside, to simply remove the blight from his pristine, lonely world. He raised his boot, but then he hesitated. A sound, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a tiny whimper carried on the wind. He frowned, dismissing it as the cry of a desert bird. He raised his boot again. Then it came again, clearer this time. A soft, desperate sound, utterly out of place in the desolate quiet. A human sound. His heart, which he believed had turned to stone, gave a sudden, painful lurch. He knelt down, his large, calloused hands trembling slightly as he carefully untied the rough rope that bound the sack. What he found inside stopped his breath. Nestled in the rough, scratchy burlap was a child. A tiny toddler, no older than 2, blonde hair matted with dust and dirt, her small face streaked with tears and what looked like a smudge of blood. Her small body was cold, stiff with exposure, and her clothes were torn and filthy. She stared up at him, her wide, blue eyes filled with a raw, primal terror. She was alive, abandoned, left to die. A wave of profound, soul-shaking horror washed over Caleb. He had seen many terrible things in his life, but the sight of this innocent child, discarded like trash, brought him to his knees. His anger, cold and absolute, raged at the unknown monsters who would do such a thing. With hands that seemed too large, too rough, he gently, carefully lifted her from the sack, cradling her tiny, shivering body against his chest. He held her close, trying to transfer his own warmth into her cold form. He looked down at her face, her eyes still wide, fixed on him. And then, as if by a miracle, her small, chapped lips parted. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper escaped her. "Mama!" The single word, so small, so innocent, so utterly devastating, struck Caleb like a physical blow. It was the first word she had ever spoken to him, a plea for a mother who was not there, directed at a man who had lost his own child. His heart, which he had believed was cold and dead, shattered into a million pieces. Tears, hot and raw, streamed down his weathered face. He held the tiny girl closer, his body shaking with a grief he had thought he had buried forever, now mixed with a fierce, burning, overwhelming sense of protectiveness. His lonely, silent world had just been shattered, and a desperate mission had just begun. The word "Mama" echoed in Caleb's ears, a haunting whisper in the vast silence of his cabin. He held the tiny girl, Lily, close, her small, cold body, a terrifyingly fragile weight in his calloused hands. He was a cowboy, a man of the range, adept at mending fences, breaking horses, tracking game through the wilderness. He knew nothing of babies. He had held his own son only briefly, a lifetime ago, before the fever claimed him. Now, he was faced with a living, breathing, utterly helpless creature who depended on him for everything. Panic, cold and stark, warred with the overwhelming protectiveness that had erupted in his chest. His first attempts at care were clumsy, almost comical. He tried to feed her the last of his dried jerky, then cursed himself. He didn't have milk, or soft clothes, or even a proper blanket. He had nothing a baby needed. He was a disaster. Lily, still traumatized and weak, responded to his awkward efforts with soft whimpers and wide, tearful eyes that mirrored his own helplessness. His heart ached with a pain he thought he had buried forever. The memories of his own lost boy, of his inability to save him, flooding back. The necessity for action, however, was absolute. He couldn't stay on the ranch. Lily needed more than he could provide. He wrapped her carefully in his cleanest, softest flannel shirt, then nestled her securely in a makeshift sling against his chest, tucking his hat low over her head to shield her from the Sunday. The sight of a grizzled cowboy riding into town with a baby strapped to his chest was unheard of, a spectacle that would invite endless questions and unwanted attention. But he had no choice. Lily was dependent on him, and he would not fail her. The journey to town was a blur of anxiety. He kept his eyes on the road, trying to ignore the speculative glances from the few other riders he encountered. He felt exposed, vulnerable, carrying this precious, fragile secret. The town itself, usually a place of quick stops and solitary errands, now felt like a gauntlet. He braced himself for the whispers, the stares, the judgment. Thorne's General Store was the biggest establishment in Redemption, and behind its worn wooden counter stood Clara. She was a woman in her mid-20s, with intelligent, observant eyes that missed nothing. She was the doctor's assistant, a kind-hearted soul known for her quiet efficiency and her genuine concern for the folks on the range. She had seen countless rough men, but never one quite like Caleb Ryder, who walked in with a bundle pressed against his chest, his face a roadmap of bewilderment and desperation. He approached the counter, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a stammering awkwardness. He tried to explain his situation, vaguely, about finding the child, about needing baby supplies. Clara listened, her eyes widening, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She didn't press for details. She simply looked at the tiny, blonde head peeking out from his sling, and then at the profound, protective love etched on his weathered face. She saw not a man who had found a child, but a man who had been found by one. Clara, with a quiet efficiency that surprised him, began to gather the items Lily needed: powdered milk, soft flannel cloths, a tiny wooden rattle. She explained how to mix the milk, how to keep the baby warm, how to recognize the signs of sickness. She spoke with a gentle, reassuring authority, her words a balm to his raw nerves. She shared stories of her own experiences helping mothers with newborns, making him feel less alone, less incompetent. She didn't judge him. She simply offered help, a practical, unwavering kindness that resonated deeply with his own desperate need. As she bundled the supplies, their hands brushed, a small, accidental touch that sparked an unexpected warmth in him. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a helpful clerk, but a woman of deep compassion, a quiet strength that mirrored the vastness of the desert outside. She was not like the women he remembered from his past, not like the judgmental townspeople. She was a lifeline, a gentle guide in a world he suddenly found himself adrift in. He thanked her, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name, and left the store, his saddlebags heavy with supplies, and his heart lighter than it had been in years. His lonely, single-minded quest for solitude had just found its first, unexpected companion. The ranch, once a sanctuary of solitude, was now transformed into a battlefield of baby supplies. Caleb, the grizzled cowboy, found himself utterly outmatched by a 2-year-old. Lily, though physically stronger with regular meals and warmth, remained deeply traumatized. She barely spoke, communicated mostly through soft whimpers and wide, watchful eyes. She allowed Caleb to feed her, to change her, to hold her, but her small face rarely showed emotion. She never cried loudly, never laughed. She was a silent, wounded bird, fragile and withdrawn. Caleb struggled. He read dusty old books on childcare he'd awkwardly bought from Clara. He tried to mimic the gentle way Clara had held her in the store. He spoke to her in low, soothing tones, telling her about the horses, the sky, the mountains. He tried to make funny faces, to bounce her on his knee, to play simple games. But Lily remained a silent, unsmiling presence. Her quiet despair was a constant, aching reminder of his own lost son, of the laughter he never got to hear. He desperately wanted to see her smile, to hear her laugh, to know that he was truly reaching her, truly healing her. Clara became his lifeline. Her visits to the ranch, initially for checking on the supplies, slowly became a regular occurrence. She would bring fresh eggs, soft cloths, and, most importantly, her gentle expertise. She taught Caleb how to recognize Lily's subtle cues, how to interpret her whimpers, how to engage her in simple games. She spoke of Lily's healing process, reassuring Caleb that trust and joy would return, but slowly, like the spring after a long winter. Caleb, grateful for her guidance, found himself anticipating her visits with an eagerness he hadn't felt in years. Her presence brought a warmth and a light into his lonely world that he hadn't realized he was missing. One sun-drenched afternoon, as Caleb was sitting on the porch, trying once again to coax a smile from Lily by showing her a carved wooden horse, his frustration was at its peak. Lily simply stared at the toy, her face blank. He felt the familiar pang of failure, the cold dread that he was not good enough, that he was incapable of bringing joy to a child. He lowered his head, a heavy sigh escaping him. He was a cowboy, not a father, not anymore. Just as despair threatened to consume him, he heard it. A sound so unexpected, so pure, so utterly miraculous, that it stopped his heart. A giggle. A tiny, breathy, perfect giggle. He looked up. Lily, her small face streaked with dirt and tears from moments before, was looking at him, a wide, uninhibited grin spreading across her face. She was laughing. Not just a small chuckle, but a full, joyful, unadulterated giggle, her body shaking with mirth. Caleb stared at her, utterly stunned. He hadn't done anything. He had just sighed in defeat. He looked down at his lap, trying to understand. And then he saw it. Prospect, the old dog, who had been lying quietly beside him, had just let out a soft, almost silent snore, a tiny puff of air that had tickled Lily's bare foot. It was the dog, his faithful companion, who had made her laugh. Overwhelmed by the sheer, unexpected joy of the moment, Caleb's own face split into a wide, unrestrained grin. A genuine, unrestrained laugh, a sound he hadn't made in years, burst from his chest. He scooped Lily into his arms, holding her close, burying his face in her soft, blonde hair. Her laughter was contagious, a wildfire of pure happiness that spread through his soul, melting away the last vestiges of his grief. This was the turning point. In that moment, he realized he wasn't trying to replace his lost son. He was simply loving this child, this Lily, for who she was, a miraculous source of joy and life. Her laughter was the bridge that finally connected his broken past to a hopeful future. He was no longer just a lonely cowboy or a struggling caregiver. He was a father again. And in Lily's pure, unadulterated giggle, he heard the music of his own heart, finally, wonderfully, beginning to heal. Lily's laughter became the anthem of the ranch. It filled the cabin with a warmth Caleb hadn't felt in a decade, chasing away the shadows of his past grief. She was thriving, a bright, curious child, her small hands exploring every corner of her new world. Caleb, guided by Clara's patient advice and his own burgeoning paternal instinct, found a rhythm to fatherhood. He would read her stories by the fire, show her the different birds on the prairie, and teach her the names of the stars. His heart, once a cold fortress, was now a garden blooming with love. Clara's visits became even more crucial. She saw the profound transformation in both Caleb and Lily, a testament to the healing power of connection. Her respect for Caleb deepened into a quiet admiration, and their friendship blossomed into something tender and unspoken. They were becoming an unconventional family, brought together by fate and an act of simple, profound kindness. Yet, a shadow still lingered, the unanswered question of Lily's past. Who would abandon such a precious child? The original burlap sack, which Caleb had kept tucked away in the barn, was a haunting reminder of the cruelty that had brought Lily into his life. One afternoon, while sorting through some old tools, Caleb's hand brushed against the sack. He paused, a strange impulse guiding him. He pulled it out, feeling its rough, familiar texture. He remembered the faint bloodstain, and then he noticed something he had overlooked in the chaos of that first night. Stitched into the coarse fabric of the sack, almost invisible against the dark material, was a small, faded mark. It wasn't a symbol or a letter. It was a brand. A distinct, crude brand used by a notorious gang of outlaws known as the Rattlers, led by a ruthless man named Silas "Snake" Morgan. A gang infamous for their brutality and their habit of operating out of a hidden stronghold in the treacherous canyons of the Black Mesa. The realization hit Caleb with the force of a physical blow. Lily hadn't been abandoned by a desperate parent. She had been discarded by outlaws. The blood stain on her dress, the cuts on her small body, they weren't just from exposure. They were from violence. The terror in her eyes that first night, her desperate, quiet withdrawal, all made a chilling, horrifying sense. She wasn't just an abandoned child. She was a survivor of unimaginable cruelty. He immediately rode to town, the sack clutched in his hand, his heart pounding with a cold, righteous fury. He showed the brand to Clara, and her face paled. She, with her knowledge of local legends and whispered rumors, knew the Rattlers. They were responsible for countless raids, thefts, and murders across the territory. She knew that Silas Morgan was a monster. Clara's mind worked quickly, connecting the pieces. The Rattlers had recently pulled off a major train robbery near the Black Mesa. They had been pursued relentlessly by the marshal's men. It was during their escape, desperate and burdened, that they must have abandoned Lily. They saw her not as a child, but as a liability, a piece of evidence, and the brutal clarity of their act sent a shiver down Caleb's spine. The mystery of Lily's abandonment was solved, but it was replaced by a far more terrifying truth. Lily was not just an orphan he had found. She was a witness. A living, breathing piece of evidence against one of the most dangerous outlaw gangs in the West. If Silas Morgan ever discovered she was alive, he would not hesitate to silence her, to eliminate the last loose end. Caleb, who had ridden into that canyon a lonely man, had stumbled not just upon a child, but into a deadly, hidden war. His home, his new family, was now directly in the path of a monster. He had saved Lily from dying in a sack, but now he had to save her from a far greater, more terrifying threat. The stakes had been raised, and the quiet peace of his ranch was about to be shattered. The knowledge of the Rattlers, of Silas Morgan's cruelty, cast a long, chilling shadow over Caleb's ranch. The laughter of Lily, once so carefree, now seemed fragile, constantly threatened. His days were no longer filled with the simple tasks of ranching, but with a new, urgent purpose, protecting his newfound family. He fortified the cabin, reinforced the windows, and kept his rifle always within reach. Prospect, the loyal old dog, seemed to sense the danger, his bark sharper, his vigilance absolute. Clara, his partner in discovery, was now his partner in this terrifying new reality. She rode to the ranch every day, bringing not just supplies, but her sharp mind and unwavering courage. She helped him plan, strategize, and stood as a constant source of strength. The friendship that had blossomed between them had deepened into an unspoken love, a bond forged in the crucible of shared danger. They were a family now, an unconventional trio bound by a precious child and a deadly secret. The threat materialized on a cold, dusty afternoon. Caleb was out checking the perimeter, with Prospect by his side, when he saw them, 3 riders, silhouetted against the setting Sunday. They weren't just passing through. They were riding with a cold, predatory purpose. He recognized the lead rider immediately from the faded wanted poster in the sheriff's office. Silas "Snake" Morgan. He had found them. Caleb's heart pounded. He knew he was outmatched. 3 men against 1, and one of them a notorious killer. He grabbed Prospect, whispering urgent commands for him to return to the cabin and stay with Lily and Clara. He drew his rifle, bracing for the inevitable fight, ready to die protecting his family. But as the outlaws approached, Morgan did something unexpected. He did not charge. He stopped at the edge of the property line, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with a calculating, venomous stare. Morgan spoke, his voice low and raspy, carrying across the silent prairie. He didn't mention the gold. He didn't mention the train robbery. He simply stated that he was looking for a piece of property, a child that had strayed from his camp months ago. He claimed she was his, and that he intended to retrieve her. He was testing Caleb, using a flimsy legal pretext, but the veiled threat in his eyes was unmistakable. He knew Lily was here. Caleb's blood ran cold. Morgan wasn't going to fight him for the child. He was going to try and take her legally, using the very system Caleb relied on, using the fact that Lily had no clear family, no legal protector. He knew that the authorities, seeing a lone cowboy with an unverified child, would side with a seemingly legitimate claim, especially from a man of Morgan's dangerous reputation. He had to act. He had to claim Lily, and he had to do it publicly, irrevocably. This was his all-in moment. He had to gamble everything. He returned to the cabin. He found Clara holding a terrified Lily. He looked at them both, his eyes filled with a love so fierce it eclipsed all fear. He knew what he had to do. He would create a family, a legal shield stronger than any rifle. He knelt down before Clara, not in a romantic gesture, but in a desperate plea for partnership and protection. He told her everything, the legal danger, the lack of his own claim to Lily. He laid bare his heart, his fear, his desperate need for her. They will take her, Clara. They will take Lily. Unless she has a family. A mother. A legal claim. I can't protect her alone. I'm just a cowboy. But if you would be her mother, if you would be my wife, then no one can touch her. Clara, will you marry me? Will you help me make her our daughter? Clara stared at him, her heart pounding. This was not a proposal born of whispered vows or moonlight, but of desperate love and dire necessity. She saw the fear in his eyes, the profound love he held for Lily, the unwavering resolve to protect them both. She thought of the little girl who had just begun to laugh again. She thought of the warmth and purpose she had found in this unconventional family. She knew her answer. She reached out, tears streaming down her face, and took his hand. She would not just be his wife. She would be Lily's mother. She would be their shield. Clara's answer was not a whispered vow, but a fierce, determined nod. This was not a romantic fantasy. It was a desperate, sacred pact. They were not just marrying for love. They were marrying for Lily, for a future, for a shield against the monster who sought to claim her. That morning, a flurry of activity transformed the Miller Ranch. Caleb, with his usual quiet efficiency, sent a ranch hand to fetch the circuit judge from the nearest town. Clara, with her sharp wit, began preparing their defense, gathering what little evidence they had. The old burlap sack, Lily's torn clothes, and her own unwavering testimony. Silas Morgan, however, was not a patient man. He arrived that afternoon, not with his men, but with a local sheriff and a town lawyer, confident in his legal claim. He intended to use the law, the very thing he usually scorned, to legitimize his cruelty. He presented his proof, a fabricated bill of sale, claiming Lily was property he had entrusted to a now-dead associate. He demanded that the sheriff remove the child from Caleb's unsuitable care and hand her over immediately. The sheriff, a good but timid man, looked uncomfortable. He knew Morgan's reputation, but the documents looked official. It seemed Caleb and Clara were cornered. But Clara, a doctor's assistant who often helped with legal documents for her father's store, had anticipated this. She stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. She first presented Lily's old, bloodied clothes and the burlap sack, pointing to the Rattler's brand. She calmly explained that these were not the clothes of a child entrusted to an associate, but of a child abandoned after a violent robbery. She then revealed the full story of the train robbery near Black Mesa, detailing the marshal's pursuit of Morgan's gang. She explained that Lily was a witness, an inconvenient piece of evidence Morgan thought he had eliminated. Morgan's face, which had been a mask of smug confidence, now contorted in a mixture of surprise and pure fury. He hadn't expected them to know about the robbery, let alone link Lily to it. He vehemently denied everything, claiming Clara was making up wild stories. It was then that Caleb, stepping forward, played his final, unexpected card. He brought out the worn, leather-bound copy of his uncle's journal. He explained that his uncle, a former prospector, had spent years tracking Morgan's gang, collecting evidence of their activities, including the very train robbery near Black Mesa. The journal contained detailed maps of Morgan's hideouts and coded entries about his crimes. The weight of the evidence was crushing. Morgan had underestimated them. He had underestimated the quiet rancher and the clever doctor's assistant. He had thought he was dealing with ignorant country folk. He had forgotten that in the West, knowledge was often more powerful than a gun. Faced with irrefutable proof and the sheriff's unwavering gaze, Morgan knew he was beaten. His game was over. With a final, venomous glare at Caleb and Clara, he was arrested. Justice, long delayed, had finally found its way to the Miller Ranch. 2 years later, the Miller Ranch was no longer just a home. It was a sanctuary, a testament to a love forged in the crucible of desperation. Caleb and Clara were married, their union blessed by the presence of a thriving, joyful Lily. The ranch, prosperous and well-managed, became a haven for those seeking a new start, its doors always open to the lost and the forgotten. Lily, now 4 years old, was a bright, curious child, her laughter echoing through the halls that were once silent. She was no longer the traumatized toddler found in a sack. She was a cherished daughter, loved fiercely by a father who had found his purpose in her, and a mother who had found her destiny by his side. One warm summer afternoon, as they sat by the creek where Caleb had first found her, Lily looked up at Caleb, her eyes sparkling with pure joy. "Papa, look, a butterfly." Caleb smiled, a profound, contented smile that reached his eyes. He squeezed Clara's hand, his heart overflowing. The word Papa was not just a name. It was the music of a life reborn, a melody of love that had silenced the echoes of the past forever. He had ridden into that canyon a lonely, broken man. But through a tiny voice in a burlap sack, he had found his true north, his family, and a love that was deeper and more enduring than any treasure. If this story of a lost child finding a family and a lonely man finding love touched your heart, click the video on your screen now for another unforgettable tale from the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us what part of Lily's story moved you the most in the comments below. Your support helps us build our own happy endings.